Welcome, everyone, to this live session today on the art of gaining executive support without overwhelming. I'm joined here today by Brian Poe, and we'll be having a great session discussing three questions. One is how to know your audience. Two is how to know what details to include in presentations or communications. And three is how do you effectively engage an audience? So Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brian Poe, founder and CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Mammoth Insights. We're a UX experimentation consultancy based out of the suburbs of Minneapolis.
Awesome. And I'm Chris, founder of the Hidden Speaker, a training consultancy that focuses on effective business and technical communication. I found when I worked in the data industry, the greatest need was not necessarily new technology, but better communication. How do stakeholders know the value of our work? How do we make sure people take action on the insights we pulled from the data? And that's what I focus on in my trainings. All right, so to kick things off, let's start off with that first question, which is how to know your audience well. And this is a key question because you can't give the same presentation effectively to every single audience you speak to. It has to be personalized or customized to some extent. So Brian, do you have some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so knowing your audience. So one of the things that I think about when really trying to evaluate your audience. And a lot of my career has been in the consulting agency space, right? I've led optimization programs at in-house brands like Best Buy, but a lot of my consulting experience has been on the agency side. And so it's really important to think about who your end audience is, right? I started my career in data and analytics. I know a lot of people that are very deep into their fields around data and analytics. And one of the things we'll talk about today is how passion can sometimes get in the way of our presentation skills. And some of the tips that I'm going to give are especially applicable to younger people in their career fields. One is considering the format that you're presenting, right? Now, Chris, you do a lot of public speaking, big audiences. Not everybody's from the same organization, which can make things a little bit tricky as to how you present information. But more applicable to this audience is going to be more of, what kind of tips can we give them as it relates to, consulting presentations or in-house presentations to other stakeholders. So one thing is it's very important to think long and hard about what your format's going to be. Is it an oral? Is it an oral format? Is it a webinar like this? Is it an in-person presentation, right? A lot of my presentations are done over video conferencing like this. How I would present in person is going to be a little bit different than how I would present here, right? You can pick up on different body language and cues and things like that when you're in person for more folks. Also, are you presenting data in a one-on-one or in a group format like this, or are you sending it over via email? Now, if I send over a deck and an email for some reason, that format's going to look very different than if I were walking somebody through a presentation live like we are talking right now.
Those are great points.
The second is considering your audience, right? And this really goes hand in hand with the format. Are you presenting to an executive? Is it how many stakeholders? Are you talking to practitioners, people that are going to be more interested in the details of your analysis? Or are you talking to a bunch of curious folks? So if you are in the consulting world, it's not uncommon to give a presentation and you think maybe 2 or 3 people, your stakeholders are coming on, but then they invite 5 or 10 other people as sort of like cross-functional exposure, maybe some training and things like that. So do the best that you can to really understand who your audience is. And that might mean that you're working with other PMs, account executives, or if you really understand or know your client, get as much detail as you can from them so that your presentation is received the best that it possibly can be. Because you don't want to get into a call or a presentation and start talking about a subject where most of the people on the call or in the room don't really know what you're talking about, or they might have a different idea of what this particular meeting is. A lot of people have meetings all day long. And so if you can make that 30 minutes or that hour as direct and effective as you can for that user. It's going to be well received. And we'll get into some frameworks and things later on some ways to how to approach those conversations, how to structure data in your presentations to make sure that they're effective and that everybody's in alignment and all those kinds of fun things. One little tidbit that I'd like to add to this, because we are talking about presentations, and something that I see very often or very frequently is that people will, and I'm sure, Chris, you have a lot to say about this too, but how people, analysts may want to just jump into a presentation, right? Okay, I've got another QBR coming up, or I'm doing another financial analysis, or I'm doing another, monthly review of XYZ. And so you can quickly grab the old deck and then swap out words and call it good. Or if you're stuck on how do I present this information, something that I kind of fell trapped to early in my career was going right to Google and looking for templates on something. And the reason that those things are problematic is that, one, your PowerPoints and your Google Slides are going to be really tempting to want to go and start formatting stuff right away, right? And if you're grabbing a template somewhere, what's problematic about that is now what you've done is you've decided on something based on its aesthetics, and you're forcing your data narrative into a format that slide wasn't designed for, right? And so one thing that I like to do, because I do a lot of research, so I'm looking at customer research, I'm looking at data and analytics, experimental data, that kind of thing. I do jump into PowerPoint right away. But when I jump into PowerPoint, I'm not tempted by, the add clip art and adding this and that, right? I use it as a way to sort of data dump, to free my mind of thoughts. So if you are the type of person that's tempted to jump into a PowerPoint and start playing with the format and fonts and all of that, maybe a Word doc is better, right? Treat it like you're writing a paper. Here are your main points, write down your bullet points, that kind of thing. Treat it like a draft or an outline. But if not, PowerPoint or Google Slide can be a really good way. And we'll talk again a little bit later on some frameworks to help organize some of that information. But that can also spark back to the original question about knowing your audience. When you started to outline data that you know is important to this business or to the client, or for this presentation or account, then having gone through some of that exercise of just sort of data dumping and coming up with interesting ideas can then also spark some thoughts and help you go back to the client, and help you kind of prep for that later meeting with them. So those are a few things that I wanted to draw attention to, because they're really common mistakes that I see in the field, and because it's just really tempting, right? We're busy. We want to jump into creating slides without really think. I always say over-index on the preparation. If you spend an immense amount of time and the data insight is one little bit of information, but it is, blows your client's mind, or it's just what they wanted, then that time up front is well spent.
I love it. And there are a few threads in there that I love to pull out more, specifically related to knowing your audience. One thing I think would be good to add is the power of AI to help us know our audience. And as you pointed out, it's so important to get the details about what our audience wants in order to deliver an effective presentation. So one means doing that manually is see who is in attendance for this particular meeting, what is their role, what are their needs. Maybe you can even ask them directly, what are you hoping to gain from this presentation? But if that's not possible, which it not always is, we can ask ChatGPT. And this is something that I talked about in a recent conference. Ask ChatGPT, hey, I see these people are coming to the meeting, to the presentation. There's a CEO present, there's a product manager present. What would they want from this? And it helps you get out of your own head. Especially if you're technical, you're focusing on all the details and the things you found. It helps you get out of your own head and realize, what do these other people want? So a great way is to use AI to help us as a brainstorming partner. And the other thread I want to pull out is you mentioned it's important to not get fixed on a certain template aesthetically early on, because then you fix your own storyline without knowing what the story is. And AI here is another great complement to that. It can help us say, okay, here's all the information I want to talk about. What are some different ways I can structure it? What are some different ways to keep people engaged and make sure that I get to the point of the meeting as concisely and efficiently as possible? And I think this is a great segue to the next question, which is, how do you know how much detail to include in a presentation?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one, and I think that this is a very complementary question to the last one, right? You want to know your audience so you can figure out how much detail to include into your presentation, right? And this one's interesting. So I'll kind of give an example to kind of make this point. I had a consultant reach out to me a few weeks ago that is a behavioral scientist by trade, and I think about a year ago or so, her and another colleague had gone out on their own, and they're doing marketing work and adding some interesting, unique flavor to some marketing analytics and media optimization and buying and that kind of thing. And one of the things she had mentioned was that that in her presentations, right, she'll conduct her research, and like most of us in this field, in the data and analytics field, we're all very passionate about what we do. Part of what draws us to the field is that we like finding those interesting nuggets of insight, and we like to talk about them, and it's what gets us excited, right? And sometimes that can be, it's not a problem, obviously. That's wonderful that you're that way. But it can get in the way of your presentation skills. And what I mean by that is that a lot of us like to explain how the sausage is made, right? Which means we want to talk about the details, the 14 different ways that we came up with this really interesting insight and how it's going to change, your audience's life and that sort of thing. Those things are really good. But the client at the end of the day doesn't care about the detail as much as you do. And they just want to know how they can use this information to make a business decision, right? And so one of the things that this consultant was running into, she would get at the end of a 60-minute presentation, the first 59 minutes was her talking about all of the interesting data and the behavioral science behind her recommendations and things like that. But then the last minute was the big so what moment, right? And she was hearing crickets, right? People didn't know how to respond. And we can talk about some of the engagement here in a little bit, how to keep people engaged and to eliminate some of that sort of thing. But her message was falling really flat because she wasn't delivering the message in a way that the client knew how to take some of those really interesting insights and apply it to their business. And one of the pieces of advice that I'd given to her was, and if you're a consultant listening, and a lot of us, I did early in my career, I would get a lot of anxiety on calls, and I'd worry about, well, am I going to have the right data for the questions that might come up, right? So those things can give us anxiety. And so if you are a consultant, know, even in-house, I think somewhat this applies, right? Is just know that you're already hired, right? They've already hired you for your expertise. So don't feel the need to over-explain the data or the information that you're presenting to your stakeholders. Slow down, take your time, make sure that you're reading body language and asking questions. Because if you can keep the client engaged earlier on in the conversation before you go over 59 minutes of data, you're going to have a much better exit at the end of that conversation. And one of the points that I skipped over earlier was knowing what success looks like at the end of your presentation, right? So that might be presenting on very specific data to help somebody make a business decision. They could be recommendations. Let's say you're a media agency and you think that there's reason for the client to increase budget. Know what it is at the end of that hour that you need the client to say or do, and that should be guiding your entire presentation. So if you really, again, over-index on preparation, but if you understand that, it will help you build a better presentation, get the right information across, and you'll know what questions to ask along the way to keep them engaged and much more likely to receive that information or recommendations towards the end of your conversation.
Absolutely. You spoke to something that I think is so important for a lot of people here listening to pay attention to, which is the anxiety aspect. When we're going into an important meeting, we are so afraid we're going to mess up, do a bad job, not engage the audience, it'll be crickets. And I have two stories I'd like to share about some reasons why people include too much detail in a presentation, and it's related to anxiety. One, I worked with a product manager who gave so much detail in her answers. We were preparing for interview responses, also giving presentations, and she gave so much technical detail. And I asked her, can you tell me more about your thought process about how you're constructing these responses and your motivation for talking about X, Y, and Z? That goes a little deeper than necessary. And she said she was so worried that her audience would judge her and criticize her for not including that detail and feel that she wasn't the expert that she actually is if she didn't include it. And that's where I had the conversation with her that you just had here, which is they've already hired you. They trust you already for your expertise. There's no need for you to embellish more than necessary. In fact, you look more confident and authoritative if you get to the point quickly and just say what people need to hear. So that helped her a ton. The second story I'd like to share is another product manager I worked with who also faced a lot of anxiety. When she was asked a question, she would immediately start talking through all the things that came to the top of her head, including a lot of detail. And I asked her again to describe more to me her thought process. And she said she was so afraid that she had to get out everything that she knew so that people would, again, not judge or criticize her. And I said, what's even more impactful is not jumping into answer right away, but if you just take a second or two to pause before you speak, to really think about it, or if you're preparing for a presentation, really take the time to think about what is your point? Because people don't just want to hear all the things you have to say, they want to know, why does it matter? What is the point you're trying to make? So I said to her, if there's a short form response, your boss asks you a question, take that moment to pause, say, I don't need to go in all these different directions to figure out what I have to say. Let me figure out what it is first, then go through it. Or for a presentation, let me figure out what is the point I'm trying to make, and then I can create the storyline and all the slides to support that point. And I think this is another perfect segue to the last question we have, which is, how do you structure a good presentation? How do you support that point in the best way possible?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of frameworks that I'd like to share. And I'll try not to speak on this too long, but there's certainly a lot of information on the internet to go and look into this a little bit yourself. And I'm sure you've got some too that you want to share too, Chris. I mean, there's lots of frameworks out there. I'm just sharing what's worked for me over the years. And so there's a Minto pyramid created by, or the Minto pyramid principle created by a lady called named Barbara Minto from McKinsey back in the 70s. And I think it's a really good framework to use. And there's a couple of parts to this. There's what's called the SCQA format. And sometimes it'll be like just the SCA, like the questions taken out, but it doesn't really matter. But the point is that it's a really effective way to start your presentation. And data storytelling is a lot like, I recently heard on a podcast, I believe it was, some comedians were talking about how important it is when they're doing like a Netflix special, how important it is. I think they said either the first 5 or the first 15 minutes of a special is most important. And if you think about the first or the beginning of your presentation, it's sort of like a hook. It's not quite a hook, but it's similar in that, a hook is like, the thumbnail on a YouTube video, or when you're on LinkedIn, and you see that really enticing first line, and then you have to hit the expand to see the rest of the content. People that are really good at writing hooks, and I'm not that person, but people that are really good at writing hooks know that the hook is the most important thing. And then the rest of the content is secondary or even tertiary. Like you could have an amazing hook, and then the rest of the content could just be sort of blah. And, that content will go really well. And that's the same thing with a story or a presentation. You have to get your audience on the same page and in agreement right away on what they're here for. Again, if you're presenting to an executive, they're coming from another meeting before they come to yours. So in a lot of cases, they're joining and they don't even know what they're there to talk about. So set really firm foundations and expectations about what the next 30, 45, 60 minutes is about, and what questions and answers you're going to address throughout that presentation. And to your point earlier, Chris, by setting this, playing more of a consultant, because at the end of the day, we're all in sales and we're all consultants to some degree, whether you're working for an agency or you're in-house. And so the more of a consultant role you can play in those conversations, you're going to grab people's attention and they're going to start paying attention. So really quickly, going over this framework, your S is your situation. This is really, why are we here? What is this describes the current context for the meeting. Your challenge is your C. This is the problem, right? Like, okay, what do we need to solve for? Then you have your question, and then your answer provides the solution to that. So I think that the SAQA framework is really, really important. One thing that I like to do also is throughout a presentation, especially when they get into that 60-minute range, is I like to look for body language. Again, I'm on video conferences all the time. And so not always can you do that because people have some people keep their cameras turned off, but most cases they don't. And so you can get the eyebrow raise or the head nod. And so those are really good invitations to pause and ask questions, right? Hey, Tom, I saw you, like that data point really resonated with you. Why? And that's important not only to break up the presentation, but it's also important because Tom or whoever that is at their company has some internal clout that you don't have, right? And so the sooner you can get people in on your side and talking about your data, your presentation, the more effective you will be in delivering that message to the rest of the crowd or the audience is listening to the same presentation. So that's it's a little bit of tidbit. I know a lot of people try to keep their heads down, but if you can, while you're presenting, try to pay attention to, people that are attending your presentation. Give examples, things like that. Keep it relevant, talk about their business, their industry, try to interject storytelling when you can. I like to, when I'm talking about experimentation, I like to have some examples in the back of my head for similar clients in the industry, or that where we were solving or trying, running an experiment on the same type of test. And I like to talk to the client and say, last month, I ran a similar experiment with another client in the same industry, and we saw some of these results, or I've run this type of test a bunch across season. So the more you can tie your story back to real life examples and prior work, again, that's going to position you as more of the consultant, more of the expert in the room, and you're much more likely to get have positive direction in your conversation with them.
There are a lot of great things that you said there, and I particularly liked your analogy to a Netflix special where you're thinking about a presentation as this experience you're giving people, and you really need to draw their attention in. An expansion of the analogy I like to use is when we're giving a presentation, if we're telling a story, that typically involves setting something up at the beginning, giving some context, the situation, complication, and then you pay it off at the end. You talk about the recommended action. So that's one form of a framework to follow. in some versions of the Minto pyramid structure that I've seen, you jump straight to the recommended actions first because the executive is short on time. So you say, this is what I need from you. This is what I want you to approve on. Then you talk about the findings that support it and then some more contextual detail. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both versions. So one is the story. You start in one place, then the actions come at the end when you've built that trust and emotional engagement. The other version is the pyramid where you start with the actions first, and then you go into the extra detail supporting it. It's always important to understand why we're using a certain framework. So we've used the Minto. If we want to get to the point quickly, people are short in time, and we can get to the detail later for those who are interested in. But if we want to build trust, emotional engagement, take people on a journey to understand why we reached a certain thing, then we would use the flip of the pyramid and start with the findings, the details, and then build up to this is what I want you to do.
It also goes back, just on that point, it also goes back to knowing your audience, right? If you're talking to other like-minded technical folks, or you know that the people on your presentation are going to want to know the details, then maybe you take that approach.
Right.
If you know that you're talking to an executive that's difficult to get their time, and you need to hit your points really quickly, maybe they say, I only have 15 minutes for this call, but you can stay on and walk through the rest with the rest of the people on the call. Then maybe a Minto. So to your point, yes, knowing your audience, knowing who you're presenting to can then also guide you in picking the right presentation framework to use. Absolutely.
And to add on to a few other things that you mentioned, you said the Minto pyramid, and also within that pyramid, you can have the situation, complication, question, answer. I like to think of all those as ingredients that we can just put in different orders. And a framework that I also share is what, so what, and now what, which is very similar to what you shared. The what could be the situation, the complication. The so what is the question, why does this matter in general? And the answer would be the now what do we do about it? And if we know our audience well, that will help us determine what order to put those ingredients, to what depth we should cook them to create some good experience for them.
One of the benefits, though, of the SCQA format, and this is something at my last firm, it became mandatory that it be included, but I found that it was very difficult for people to deliver. And part of that is that the reason for that is that the individuals didn't understand the business well enough. So what inevitably happened is at the beginning of a presentation, you have your situation, your complication, and it's literally spelled out and they're reading from slides. You want to avoid that. If you are delivering an SCQA format, one of the benefits is that to write one effective, and which means that you've got to really kind of get to the point. It helps you get really clear, really quick in what your presentation is about. And it will also remove a lot of the fluff, any of the extraneous information that you might otherwise want to include. So my recommendation, if you use a framework like that, use the SCQA, that you understand that client and their needs, their problems, and their challenges, and don't read it from slides. But it can be really, really effective if you're able to conversationally talk through what the SCQA is, because if you can slow down and talk to about their business carefully and slowly, again, going back to the hook, you'll have people's attention right at the beginning of your presentation, and they'll much more likely be engaged for the rest of your talk.
Absolutely. And I think a great analogy and story related to that, I was helping someone with interviewing, and STAR is the typical framework that's used for that. I was listening to them give the response, and their response went something like, the situation was, then the task I did was, and then the action I took was, and it's just formulaic and robotic if you just follow it scripted in that way. And a great point I want to emphasize here is that all of these frameworks we talked about, they should not be followed to the letter. We should understand why we're using them. And why we're using them is we have a point we want to make. They're just helping us make it in different varieties and formats. So Minto, get the action first, because that's the most important thing. Or in situation, complication, question, answer, we're talking about the situation first to set the scene, bring in the hook. It's all different things pointing to that point. So the point is the most important thing to remember, and then just gaining the fluidity and comfort with talking through all the things we know to support that point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So I do see we're close to time. And here I'd like to wrap up. And awesome to hear your insights on all these topics related to gaining executive support, knowing your audience, going through how do you determine how much detail. And it all boils down to who am I speaking to? What are their needs? What structure in a presentation can I use to best support my argument and get them to buy into what I'm saying? So for those who'd like to follow you, Brian, or connect with you, where would be the best place to do that?
Just if you're listening here, you're on LinkedIn Live, just connect with me on LinkedIn, or email me at brian@mammoth-insights.io, and happy to talk about anything experimentation, CRO, UX related.
Awesome. And for anyone listening who'd like to follow more on communication, presentation, storytelling content, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn here, or also check out my website, thehiddenspeaker.com. Awesome. So thank you everybody for joining, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.